Retired, Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay and Mr. Jayadeva Ranade as participants for this roundtable discussion on the subject, Securing India and Indo-Pacific Region Collaborating for Comprehensive Security. Vice Admiral Anil Chopra, retired, has been the Commander-in-Chief of both the Western Naval Command and the Eastern Naval Command. Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay, who has had an illustrious career in the Indian Foreign Service, and has served as Ambassador of India to Syria, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. Sri Jayadeva Ranade, a former Additional Secretary in the Cabinet Secretariat, Government of India, is a seasoned security and intelligence expert and President of the newly established Center for China Analysis and Strategy. I now request the participants to kindly occupy their seats on the stage, please, sir. Fade out the music, please. Over to General Shukla, please.
So, right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. To take the conversation with the Chief further, to deepen the dive, so to speak, we have on the panel three gentlemen of great repute and eminence. You've just been introduced to them. Vice Admiral Anil Chopra, Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay, and Mr. Jayadeva Ranade. So sailor, diplomat, and spy. The soldier is perhaps missing. Soldier is moderating. I won't bother to introduce them because it has just been done. Let me get on with the conversation straight away. And the first question, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, if I may begin with you, sir. The world is on an edge. It is actually on a powder keg. Cold War 2.0 that Henry Kissinger and Neil Ferguson speak about seems to be hotting up. Is Ukraine the first hot war of Cold War 2.0? Is it so dramatic? And will the Israel-Hamas conflict escalate into wider war in the West Asian theater? Could these distractions, and next year we have the series of elections, Taiwan in January, India later in, I think, April, May, and the United States later in the year, November. Could these distractions embolden aggression in Taiwan? Why is diplomacy wilting, failing so often? And is this spiraling conflict, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, prospectively in the Far East, is the arc of conflict moving closer home? I mean, it worries all of us greatly. So your views on this?
Thank you very much, General Shukla. Before I start, let me first congratulate the Indian Army and the clause for this curtain raiser, which is going to lead to the Chanakya defense dialogues. I think, as you hinted, in many ways it sort of presages and it announces a kind of maturation of strategic thinking in India. A lot of it, I must say, and I must say with great sort of pleasure, coming actually from the Indian Armed Forces. There's always been a larger strategic community, but we see a much greater presence of the Indian Army and the armed forces in general. Now, you've actually asked me, a whole series of very rolling questions. So I think it's very tempting to look at the world in terms of the past, in terms of the Cold War, and there are certainly many parallels, antecedents, to be gained from it. But perhaps it may be actually more instructive to see what are the differences. And if I look at the differences, one of the first is that, the Cold War was essentially a bipolar world. But it was also a bipolar world which offered a third leg. And that third leg, in many ways, was constituted by the United Nations, by the non-aligned movement, and by the other sort of much larger international third pole that there was at that time. And, to just hint at your question on diplomacy, and that provided the space for diplomacy. that provided the space for great statesmen from other parts of the world. So it provided a room for statesmanship as well. And I would say in many ways it was the golden age of diplomacy at that time. The big difference that we see from then to now is that Cold War 2.0, if I might borrow that, is much less defined. It is not bipolar, for one. I would say that it has at least 3 independent poles. People tend to ignore Russia, but Russia has shown in Ukraine that in many ways it is capable of acting as an independent pole in world affairs. And the other emerging nations that we talk about, still are not independent players. They still require the support of one or the other pole to be able to act. So I think firstly it's less defined. Secondly, there's one major change from the past, which is that in the Cold War, both sides, whether it was the socialist bloc or, so to say, the US bloc, they talked in terms of the greater, larger common good. Whether it was free enterprise, open societies, or it was internationalism, labor rights, and so on. Now what we are seeing is a very new creed. And this new creed is the creed of, my interest first, America first, China first, India first. Much more selfish creed. And this selfish creed, of course, leads to much great, and where values, in fact, have kind of diminished. And in many ways, when you look at the phenomenon called AUKUS, what do you see? You see that the values really ultimately boil down to an Anglo-Saxon cohesion, which is basically a racial cohesion. So I think the values have diminished in this larger space, and you have much more transactional alliances, what we like to call coalitions, temporary coalitions. But on the whole, what it means is that we are heading towards a much more Hobbesian state of international relations. Much more each country, each entity for itself. And what is probably even more worrying is that simultaneously with this, the technologies are growing, the importance of power is growing, power concentrations are growing. You have demagogues, you have populists, you have kind of all kinds of, and there are very few controls. Now, to come back to that final question of yours, diplomacy, wilting, diplomacy, future, and so on, I think this is the space in which diplomacy has shrunk, and which is why you see the United Nations in the state that it is today, almost incapable of playing any role in any major international affairs. And the UN Secretary General makes one statement and is sort of, very solidly challenged by a member in the United Nations itself. So I hope that sort of generally answers your question. But one point that you made on Ukraine. So a third very interesting distinction, I think, is that, in the Cold War, wars took place all over the world. This was the period of decolonization. You had the Soviet Union, and particularly involved in, challenging the United States and Latin America, Central America, Africa, Asia. But there was no hot war in Europe. You had challenges in 1956 in Hungary, 1968 in Czechoslovakia, but none of them led to a hot war. This time, in fact, in a way, this Cold War 2.0, it's not that it doesn't have an antecedent. In Syria, Russia is there, Iran and Turkey are there, the United States is there. But this time, in some peculiar way, the hot war of Cold War 2.0 is inaugurated right at the doorstep of Russia. So I think there's something to sort of ponder upon there. And there are these other flashpoints. You mentioned the Middle East, Ukraine you also mentioned. But I would say, you also mentioned Taiwan. And in a less sort of significant way, the South China Sea is there, the India-China border tensions are there. So you have the possibility of, things spinning out of control and coming closer home. And yet, I think the technologies have become so powerful, almost in each of these theaters we have nuclear powers involved, that there is a hesitation. Let's say if we take the Israel-Hamas war right now, there is a hesitation even on the part of those who are closest to the Arab world to get involved. And the United States also is exerting its influence to try to see that it does not turn into a regional war. I would say that there are restraints even in the Russia-Ukraine war. And whether China could take advantage of that, I think it is very tempting given the scenario that you spelt out. And ultimately, perhaps, there are greater experts on China than me here. But my guess would be that, if China starts something in Taiwan, then we are into another world war. Almost any of the other conflicts are limited to certain theaters. But if China enters that, it runs the risk of becoming, of forcing countries to choose which side they would be on. And that itself could be a restraint in this particular case. But I would also say that, domestic politics are the final drivers of such decisions, and a lot depends on what happens in China.
The supreme irony, sir, was I think 1 week before 7th October, when Jake Sullivan was asked in some press conference as to how he looked at the Middle East. He said, well, that's one place we don't need to spend too much time because things are by and large settling, and see what happens. So that's how unpredictable world affairs are. And though I said diplomacy wilting, actually this is a time for diplomacy to get even more challenged, step up if you have to prevent conflict. As a corollary, Admiral Chopra, I mean, this is another question which is doing the rounds in strategic circles. Is the 300-year-old global commercial maritime order, the Anglo-Saxon global commercial maritime order, being challenged by a new axis, Russia, China, and Iran? And just to kind of suggest why it may be so worrisome, I'll just give you a set of figures. So this American thinker John Thornton tells us that after Ukraine, out of 170 countries in Latin America, West Asia, the Indo-Pacific, only 5 applied sanctions against Russia. The rest were hedging, or they were with Russia. So this just tells you how strong this axis could be and how vigorous the challenge could be. After 7th October, much of the global south, if we are to be honest, is with the Palestinians. So the world is indeed getting divided. And as a military man, what appears most significant to me is this American military enterprise, $950 billion, 800 bases, 11 aircraft carriers, and it is failing to underwrite American foreign policy. So with your ears in the Navy and the world of strategic military affairs, what would your comment be, sir?
Thank you, General. You asked me a lot of questions. I'll try my best. Always a pleasure, though I'm the solitary sailor. It's always a pleasure to talk to an auditorium full of land warriors. Yes, certainly we all know that the world order is changing and evolving ever since the end of the Cold War, and no real pattern has emerged. He asked me about Russia, China, and Iran. Almost anybody should be able to discern that this is shaping up to be a sort of challenge to what is the Anglo-Saxon and maritime order. So this perhaps brings back the ghost of Mackinder and Eurasia being the world island, where global power depends on being able to control Eurasia. This is the postulate of Mackinder, not really been proved in reality. The fact is, if China, Russia, and Iran, or any such combination, wants to challenge the current world order, it will have to do it in the maritime sphere. This has got, we all know that ever since the age of discovery, which founded the concept of the globe itself, all global power, all great power, has been vested in maritime powers. Over the last 500 years, from Spain to Portugal and the current Anglo-Saxon one. This has got nothing to do with navies. This has got to do with the natural and legal advantages afforded by 3/4 of the surface of our planet, which is legally owned by nobody. It's completely no property rights. So on 3/4 of the planet, you can move around at will, legally. And the ocean is one, most people forget. They talk Indian Ocean Pacific. These are administrative divisions. If you are at one point on the surface of this earth on water, you're connected to every other point. There is no way you can't reach anywhere. So everyone with a coastline is my border. So to come back to this, that's why many powers, and the French and Dutch and British fought for it, finally tried to grasp the maritime domain. And the current order is clearly Anglo-Saxon. The Royal Navy's decline rose with the US Navy's rise, and now it's been sort of globalized with not only Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the UK, but Japan, Korea, and it's a sort of global network of being able to project force. As I said, and I'm trying to stick to this China, Russia, Iran thing, if it is to challenge them, they will have to challenge this not continentally, but at sea. And I have my doubts because many people have tried it in the past, including Imperial Russia, Imperial Germany, the Kaiser, everybody. But they did not succeed because they didn't have control over the most, should I say, an area which is you can move around the globe if you have the will and the might to do so. So that's why I think what will happen. And frankly, global power, what does it really mean? It means you should have the simultaneous capacity to be present and have combat capability all across the globe. The last people who had it, other than the present guys, are the Soviets. The Soviets were present in every ocean of the world. They could project power onto almost any landmass. And projecting power is not about amphibious and expeditionary issues. Today, navies have the capacity to inflict serious damage from thousands of miles in no man's land. For example, the Indian Peninsula, in any future real conflict, is vulnerable to attack from the sea, which is no man's land, and not from 10 miles, but from 600-700 miles, in precision-guided munitions. So there are all sorts of power plays. I don't have the time, but what I'd like to just say is that maritime power is used in peacetime as much as in wartime. It furthers interest as much as it deals with threats. And it is it's all about offensive maneuver. Think of tank country without the need for any lines of communication. No roads, no logistics, no terrain, no weather. You can just move anywhere. Ever since the steamship came and you could propel without the wind, you can more or less move in 360 degrees and you're very mobile. These are some of the advantages of the medium. So it's not a thing about, and it often becomes an issue about funding of armies and navies. It's not that at all. It is just the nature of the planet, the nature of the medium, and the nature of international law. So I have my doubts on this axis, but we'll have to see. What he mentioned again about US military power, and I think some of you may agree even in Ukraine with the Russians, there is a natural tendency today to hesitate using conventional power, forget nuclear, because the destructive capacity of conventional power has become so huge and collateral damage so much, which affects the economies of everybody, that major powers such as the US or Russia for that matter are hesitant, in my view, to use the full capability they possess. And that is one of the reasons, I think, why they rather fight proxy wars or not get involved in a full-fledged conventional conflict. This hesitancy, this restraint does not allow the full capacities to come into play. And should it turn into a larger war, then the potency of these 800 bases and 11 carrier groups and airborne divisions and air forces is pretty huge. Forget the nuclear angle. So I don't think and finally, as we all know, as at least the uniform fraternity will agree, we are there to prevent wars. We are there for deterrence. If a war breaks out, we fail. Armed forces of the kind that India now possesses, or which are there with the major powers, are meant to fight wars only if if the whole thing has failed, deterrence, diplomacy, and everything else. So I think, and as we progress this conversation, maybe we need to continue building deterrence. We need to continue building capacity. We need to continue building potency, operational readiness, etc. I could go on, but I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Mr. Ranade, sir, to you, I think the most critical question of the decade, perhaps the critical question up to 2050. How do you look at the geopolitics of the evolving Sino-Indian contest? Do you think our trajectories will inevitably clash? One tiger on a hill or two prosperous tigers on the opposing slopes of the Himalayan ranges?
You know, crystal ball gazing is always a very dicey proposition.
That's why we call you in.
Yes, but let me say that from what I've been reading, what I've been seeing and hearing, it's going to be a very turbulent period for us vis-a-vis China. I think China's aim is to try and cow us down. I don't think we are willing to be cowed down. And China's aim is to be the sole power in this region. As you said, the only tiger on the mountaintop. They've been saying that since the time of Mao, that, you know, Asia is our backyard, we are going to be there. We, on the other hand, have been saying that there's enough space for all. The Chinese don't buy that argument. Of late, with Xi Jinping's coming there, I think the equations have changed. The caution that was exercised by earlier leaders has been discarded. Xi Jinping is becoming more aggressive, has become more aggressive. It's almost as if he's in a race against time. He wants to achieve this dominance within his term. He's extended his term. We don't know whether he'll extend it further. But let us assume that he has a 5-year period. That's what we are looking at now. I think he's signaled very clearly at the opening of this term, on the first day of the party congress, on the 20th party congress, that he showed a video, which has never been done, of the clashes at Galwan. And that was a clear signal to all the people attending that conference, the opening day, which were the top leadership of the party, top leadership of the army, top leadership of the government. The message was that this is the state of India-China relations, and this is how it's going to be, at least as long as I'm there, unless they bow down to my demands. So that is the template that I see. I don't see sort of a rapprochement or anything. The Chinese are also looking at the negotiations that are going on, the border negotiations between the commanders, essentially as a buying time process. Their assessment is that by having these negotiations, India is unlikely to undertake any military adventure or even try and push them back as long as this process is on, because India will feel that through diplomacy they'll be able to sort things out. The Chinese don't have that intention at all. So I think what we are looking at is a long period of basically wearing each other down and trying to see how we are able to gain advantageous positions from where we are. On the other hand, the Chinese have also, and I mention this because, you know, we should not get away with the feeling that we are on the back foot, because we aren't really. The Chinese, on the other hand, have challenged the United States. And I think that is something that is in the background, which is extremely important, because that, once that is sorted out, we will exactly know which triangulation, as you were referring to, China, Russia, India, Iran, which triangulation is going to dominate. I think that is going to be a fairly long drawn-out situation. And for us, if that escalates, it will be beneficial for us. But in our own area, I think what I'm seeing, particularly over the last year in Tibet, the militarization of Tibet, the building up of force in Tibet, the creation of structures in Tibet, particularly in Ningxia, opposite Arunachal. These are signs which indicate that this period of tension will continue for a while. So I'm afraid it's a pessimistic response to what you asked. I think we should be prepared for a long period of tension, possible conflagrations, and turbulence with the Chinese.
Very quickly, sir, sequentially, what do you see happening first, Taiwan or something on the LAC? Or is that a stupid question?
No, I certainly won't say it's a stupid question. It's something that's been on everyone's mind. Let me just put it like this. Taiwan implies drawing the United States into whatever confrontation is taking place. With us, there is no United States involvement. I mean, there may be a noise, there may be some, raising issues in the United Nations, but it will be between the Chinese and us. I don't see the United States getting involved. I'm not talking about sharing of intelligence, etc., but on the ground, it will be us. So I think, on balance, while their DNA, which they have created, they have built up, the communists in China, has been that Taiwan must be taken back, I think they would be prepared to wait a while. With us, that might not be the case.
Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, I have a question on the changing nature, the metaphysics of the international order. So I'll just make a comment and then draw your response to that. There was a time when Bill Clinton said it's the economy stupid, and rightly so perhaps. Today, sir, it would seem to me that while economics is the mainstay, it is increasingly becoming national security stupid. The ability of nations to convert economic surpluses into hard power and the skill with which you do it, that does seem to be the reality. You just look at the fact of wars raging despite economic interdependencies. 2 points I'll just make. The Ukraine conflict, I'm told, notwithstanding, American imports of uranium from Russia over the last 12 months have doubled. Despite this Western embargo on Russian hydrocarbons, till very recently, if I'm not mistaken, hydrocarbons flowed freely from Russia to Europe, with the Russians paying a transit fee to their enemies, the Ukrainians. So this business of economic interdependencies, precluding conflict, is not. Look at Iran, sir. That's even more worrying. Despite the crippling sanctions, its heft as a regional hegemon has grown, from Syria to Lebanon to Yemen. Look at the threat it is posing to Israel and the United States directly. So in this sense, any observations, thoughts on how the metaphysics, the first principles of the international order are changing?
Interesting question. Let me try to answer that in two ways. And in a way, come back to a point about China. You know, sometimes I've been sort of plagued by the thought that the rise of China was first of all an economic rise. And it was an economic rise that was converted into military power and strategic influence. And they continue to use the economy as a tool of strategic influence. But the international responses, and this has something to do with the whole question of security and economy, the international responses to China have been primarily military political. And they have not been adequately economic. In fact, economically, one could argue that the West has compromised with China and is now hostage to China in many areas. So this is one point. So in a way, we need to think of strategic responses that are, that respond to the nature of the rise of China itself, which means basically at some level or the other, economic responses as well as military responses. Secondly, in some ways, we need to look, the security industry is possibly the fastest rising industry after artificial intelligence, if you ask me, today in the world. And we need to look whether in some ways this is literally serving that sort of military, political, call it an industry, if you like. But to come back to, I think, what was the core of your question, which is are economic ties, economic relations, economic interdependencies sufficient to prevent war? And I would say on the balance, it is not sufficient, but it is definitely an inhibiting factor. And some of the examples that you gave could be reasons why they haven't taken on a completely. There are two situations in which all inhibitions can be lost. One is fraternal wars. Fraternal wars very often can, you can harm yourself to harm your brother in some respects. And the second is when you have simply no stakes in each other. Now, in almost every other situation, people have stakes. But even those stakes, I will divide into three categories. One kind of stake is trade. Now, trade is buying and selling. It's like going to the market and buying what you want and selling what you want. If you don't like the person, you can change to someone else. But there's a second category of things that you need that only one person can provide. So you take the case of Australia and lithium and China. At the end of, a period of cold, coldness between China and Australia, they are back to business. I think the Australian Prime Minister is going to be visiting China very soon. So there are certain things that you need which can only be provided by a potential rival, and so that tempers the relationship. But the third and the more interesting one, and I think one that we haven't managed to do with Pakistan, for example, is investments. And even within investments, I would say cross-investments. Because when your economic relationship is one of a cross-investment or an investment relationship, then you actually have a stake in that country and in that economy. And that actually complicates or inhibits. And I think China and US is a classic case of this kind of cross-investment. And in the case of India and Pakistan, the Pakistani army has ensured that at the period that India-Pakistan relations was improving, when we had a composite dialogue, when we had confidence-building measures between the, the armed forces, and we had people-to-people contacts that were sort of, growing. At that point, even though you had a businessman prime minister like Nawaz Sharif, who wanted to, to stimulate India-Pakistan trade, the Pakistani army never allowed it. And so that sort of relationship, economic relationship, was not allowed to set in. So I don't know if I have sort of adequately answered your question, but I feel that on balance, it is still a tempering relationship.
Yes, Admiral Chopra, if you may cut to the chase further. Given what the Chief told us in the morning, what Mr. Ranade has just said, and the limitations of, say, our economic pie, where do we invest more? The LOC or the Indo-Pacific? Which should be a higher national security priority? Strategic impulse tells you the oceans, but common sense seems to suggest the LAC. So what is your response to this, sir, and how do you look at the geography of the Indo-Pacific in that context?
Thank you. Difficult question under the circumstances, but...
Ideally, a general should have answered that. But
yeah, no. Well, I think it's a very pertinent question, and there is, in my view, it can't be either or, it has to be and. For the simple reason, let me put it this way, that man lives on land, the affairs of humanity are decided on land. The navies have maneuver and mobility, and they have disproportionate impact on these events on land. Keep that aside. The other thing is that the LAC, as you said, is a two-way thing. It's between India and China. The Indo-Pacific involves very many countries and is now no longer a maritime construct. I would go so far as to say that the Indo-Pacific has become a geography, a strategic geography, which has Africa, Asia, Australasia, Oceania, Arctic and Antarctic all clubbed together. So it's a much wider ambit. Now your specific question, let me begin by saying, and I think if you just put your hats on, you'll agree, China, despite the PLA Navy, is extremely vulnerable in the Indian Ocean. This vulnerability stems from the dependency, not from us. The dependency of China on Indian Ocean sea lanes for energy, for resources, for markets is huge. They realize this vulnerability. I don't know how many of us do, because this vulnerability can cast a spanner in their entire economic military strength. One of the ways they would like to, India sits astride this and can easily interfere with it if push comes to shove. It can also moderate its behavior in the north. But the fact is that China keeps triggering the LAC and as a good strategic sort of ploy to keep moving our focus away from the oceans, our funding, our focus, our interest. And it works. Every time they open up the LAC, we get involved as we have to. You cannot ignore the LAC. That is immediate. And so I would agree that there's no question of LAC or the Indo-Pacific. You have to look after the LAC. But the LAC is used by China all the time to divert your attention from its vulnerability. And most of the time it succeeds, except if you really are discerning and look at the larger picture. One would say that what is required on the LAC has to be met, is immediate, but it's a two-way affair between China and India. There'll be a skirmish, there'll be a larger war, maybe like 62, but eventually there is no territorial takes in today's world. There may be some salami slicing, but it's not likely to be like German panzers rolling across Europe. So there's necessity to deter them, and we are doing it. But we don't have offensive capability in the north as much as we have in the sea. We are trying to build it, and we should, but all I want to draw your attention to is what you asked me last, is the geography. Everything is geography. That's why geopolitics, geostrategy, geoeconomics. Geography is destiny, and China has very bad maritime geography. The other two countries which have very bad maritime geography are Russia and Germany. Therefore, despite the efforts of Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, the Soviet Union, it's difficult for the Russians to break out, except from the Black Sea or from the North Sea, into the wider oceans of the world. Germany has even less. Russia and Germany were continental powers, not because of choice. They had no choice. They had no access to the sea. The same problem China faces. Can keep building 400 ships, can keep building what you want. The Chinese are stuck in that region because of poor geography, both access and egress from the Indian Ocean and from the Miyako and Bashit Islands into the Pacific. So in peacetime, he'll come. He comes, everybody can come through the Malacca Straits. But if we are in conflict, how will he come? And if he's there already, how will he go out? Not easy questions. We know them, he knows them. But the problem with the maritime conflict is it comes at the end. Because once the navies get involved, then you're in full-fledged war after the land or the air thing. And then all ships, including oil ships and cargo ships, are fair game. He is banking on the fact that we will not have the gumption or the political will to ever do that. It's just like the nuclear sin. The antagonist must be sure that you will use the nuclear weapon in a certain circumstance if it is to be effective. Similarly, he must be sure that you will use air power or sea power when it's required. He's hoping that he keeps engaging us in the LAC, and we keep meeting his challenge, which we are doing well, courtesy of the Indian Army, but he wants it to be stick there. He doesn't want any eyes down south. So that's the broader scene. The geography is poor for China. We are sitting on 5 naval bases in the main peninsular Jutland, but it all depends. He is vulnerable only if we have capability. If we don't have maritime capability, all the vulnerabilities come to naught. He's not vulnerable. So again, it's a broader question, and I think we need to both look at the LSCs certainly, and we need to continue building up our maritime strength. Thank you.
Mr. Ranade, this deterrence piece, Admiral Chopra referred to the value of deterrence. If I may paraphrase it in a different manner, deterrence is costly, but wars are costlier. In that context, when we look at the power play between India and China, the operational rebalancing that has been carried out will perhaps take care of the operational segment of their deterrence. But there are three issues which should be of greater concern to us. One is this whole drone, missile, air defense complex. You just see the Iranians. Today they are using the Hezbollah's 150,000 strong rocket arsenal like a second strike option. I mean, telling Israel and US that if you escalate, this is what we will do. The Chinese rocket arsenal of ballistic, cruise, and hypersonics is even more sophisticated. That is one. Two is this point I pointed out in the morning, digitization of combat. And therefore, this is deterrence across theaters, not just land, but land, maritime, and air. And the third is China's nuclear breakout. What it has done over the last 2 years, numbers, accuracies, tonnages. Some writings tell us they are moving away from NFU to LOW. So the aggregate nuclear posture. In these three dimensions, should we not be doing much more? Or is this largely media exaggerations, social media fluff? What is your view, sir?
Firstly, let me say that I don't think that a lot of it is fluff. A lot of it is fact. How competent they are in using those technologies or using that the missiles is another matter. As far as missiles are concerned, they have allocated a huge amount of money to the rocket force, an undisclosed but huge amount of money to the strategic support force for new technology and new weapons, which they are utilizing. As far as the rocket force is concerned, they've added on, as far as I know, a couple of brigades, some of which are deployed in the Western Theater Command, which means that they're poised for use against us. But I don't think, I think that these are primarily conventional missiles which will be used. That is part of their planning, that when they do mount a full-fledged attack, it will be cyber followed by missiles. That's what their thinking is. The second aspect is the digitization. From what I read, and obviously what comes in the media is not, in all detail, but what one reads is that they are still working on digitization, working on, as they say, working on that going down to the battalion and company level. So it's not a job that has been done. It's still a work in progress. Similarly, AI, I think it's still in the nascent stages of introduction and use in the People's Liberation Army. Now, I'm not saying that we need to ignore it. We certainly cannot ignore it. But, I mean, as we heard the chief say earlier today, the Indian Army is also making a lot of progress. Now, one doesn't know how to compare the two. But the point that you were, I think, hinting at is about their using, their nuclear capabilities against us. Now, that's something the Chinese have been talking about again. I mean, I wouldn't like to go back, but from the time of Mao, that, all right, even if there's a nuclear war, at the end of the day, there'll be at least 3 Chinese left and none of you. That was his remark to the Americans. So that may be somewhere at the back of their mind, the kind of thinking. But all this, what they're developing, they're actually developing against the United States and the West. It's not against us. I think there will be another factor. If they use this arsenal against us, then firstly, they will be running the risk of isolating themselves internationally. Second, you cannot predict which direction the fallout would go. I mean, if it comes to that. So I would hesitate to say that, at least from what I see today, that they would be using that. But yes, the other stuff they will. They've made advances, for example, in quantum communications, etc. These are very dicey things as far as we are concerned. Hypersonics, so are we doing it? But here, for us, we will have to look at building up a counter capability. And that is something that is not easy. you referred to the drones that Iran has. We know, I mean, I'm sure you're aware that the drones were developed by them, tested in Ukraine, refined in Ukraine. It was done with Russian assistance, and then brought back and used against Israel by Hamas. So they have tested it out, and they have got through the Iron Dome that the Israelis built. So Israelis will now be working on something more refined. That is the kind of thing that I think we would need to do. We certainly cannot ignore the advances that they made. They put a lot of money into it. And in their case, what we are doing now, what again the chief was talking about, identifying startups, scaling them up, etc. They've been doing it for a while. That civil-military fusion is actually the marriage of private, so-called private or state-owned civilian infrastructure with the military industry. So they're working together. For example, you know, there was a lot of noise made about Huawei. Huawei has been training companies and battalions of the PLA in cyber warfare by embedding them in the firm. And their employees are embedded in companies and battalions and brigades of the PLA. So that is the kind of synergy that they have, which we are far from getting right now. So when we look at what China has done, it has been working on this for many years. And that is the problem that we face. But at the same time, having said that, I think the education levels of the people who are joining the PLA, the recruitment that's taking place, are not very high. And in order to encourage them in the last few years, they have dropped the standards, the physical requirement standards, which may not be all that important when it's technology based, but the people who are joining don't want to serve for very long. They want to get out in 2 to 3 years. So these are factors that I think will inhibit their technological capability, despite all this effort that is being made.
Before I move on to the next issue, just one very brief observation on the rocket force and why I think we need to take it far more seriously. It has shaken up the Americans in the Indo-Pacific. I'm quoting Admiral Paparo, I think, who's the CNC designate of IPACOM. He says the DF-21-26 bases have altered the principles of naval warfare in the Western Pacific. It is central to the Taiwan peace. It may well have challenged America's ability to project power into the Western Pacific. So that is how, in my view, serious the challenge is. See what they are doing in terms of dispersing their B-52s from Guam, how they are reinvigorating their entire Aegis, THAAD, Patriot network. So this AD missile complex, in that sense, Western militaries and those that they have patterned themselves on Western militaries have tended to, I would say, place less priority on. India is one of them. And now, given what is happening with Iran and all that, I think we need to look at it with far more caution.
Certainly,
but the next,
I agree with you on that. And I'd also add the drones to that. I mean, the way they're manufacturing the drones and they're deploying them, including across our borders, is worrying, which is why I mentioned rocket force deployments in the Western Theater Command. It is something that is worrying.
Now, one more, issue, while we've always been talking of China and the IOR, legitimately so, should the Western horizons not worry us equally? And now look at the conundrum. Given what's happened on 7th October, is there no possibility of the terror threat recoalesce along our Western horizons? Look at the JEM, LET, TTA, TTP, ISIS remnants, Al-Qaeda remnants. I mean, they could be plotting just like Hamas was. And what is even more worrying, sir, and this question is open to all the panelists, this new potent axis which is developing, and may I point out, Pakistan, Taliban, Iran, Turkey, this drone superpower, it's rewriting the politics of Eurasia, China, Russia. So the aggregation of terror, these proxies, Iran and its proxies, regional military players like Turkey and Iran, whom we tended to be very dismissive of. And also big power competition coming back to the West, because the space that USA is trying to vacate, China is filling it. So now, where should Indian priorities lie? Up north? Should we peer southwards into the IOR? Or the growing adversarialities from the west? I mean, they are as grim.
Yeah, you're quite right. But here, if I can just make a point that certainly, as I said, the contest is between the United States on the one hand and China and Russia on the other. And China and Russia are not accepting the current international world order, whatever that is, and they're trying to change it. Russia, in fact, has fired the first shot in Ukraine. Both are determined. Both have advanced alternative models for the rest of the world. China has advanced the Global Development Initiative, Security Initiative, and the Civilization Initiative. So that's one aspect. Which brings me to the second point about this terror, shall I say, network which is developing, as you pointed out, stemming from the Middle East. It is, of course, very worrying for us. It will be very worrying for the West, because that is where the attacks will take place in the first instance. For us, of course, there will be a coalition, which the Pakistanis will try and put forward. But what I'm trying to get at is, while this will happen, for China and Russia, that is just a stepping stone for what they want. And the frictions will develop in course of time between them and the others. But the main issue is, will they be able to hold together? Because they themselves are divided. You've got a Sunni and Shia business. You've got competing interests between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq, which is still there. So I don't know. I mean, in the long term, whether this there will be isolated incidents, but whether they will act as in concert as a group, I'm not sure about that.
Thank you. May I take that, answer that question by picking up something that Admiral Chopra said? He made a very interesting point about China's vulnerability at the sea. And I would like to pose, and this is in the context of the maritime and continental, and I would like to pose a question to all of us here. Is it possible to seize China's nibbling in Ladakh as a way of actually breaking out from the Malacca dilemma and the South China Sea Malacca trap, and trying to reach its energy and other sort of economic targets in West Asia through the continental massif of Central Asia? In other words, China is using this entire pressure that is facing in the South China Sea and the Malacca area and the Indo-Pacific in general to break through the Pamirs and the Hindu Kush and perhaps the Karakoram and other ranges, and through Afghanistan and through Central Asia be able to reach the Gulf and its energy sources, bearing in mind that it also has a 25-year, 400 billion geo-economic deal with Iran with clearly strategic connotations. And the second point related to that is that, in the Western thinking, we see a great reliance on theaters of war. And so, you have PACOM and you have West Asia, and particularly in the context of the pivot to the Indo-Pacific, what we are seeing is the United States, for example, outsourced its interests in West Asia that you were talking about to the West Asian Quad. And then suddenly it's got a rude shock with what's happened in Israel today. Now, if I see, and I'm not very deep into Chinese strategic literature, if I see Chinese thinking, I don't see this kind of dichotomy between maritime and continental. In fact, if one thing China does extremely well is to think holistically and to think in terms of the weak spots, of the asymmetries where it can take advantage. And that's as true for weapons of warfare as anything else. So China is able to leverage lesser power to greater effect in many ways. And that even applies to politics. I mean, look at the United States scoring a self-goal with the Trump elections, with the last election, sorry, and the insurrection launched by the Trump supporters. So in many ways, I agree with Admiral Chopra that we need to get out of this maritime continental dichotomy. We are 100% continental power and we are 100% maritime power. We are very nicely located in between, and we need to have this holistic perspective as well. And we need to look at China's games also from a holistic perspective. That means there could be a strategic play that is taking place through Central Asia. Why this sudden interest in Afghanistan? China had no interest in Afghanistan until very recently. So that I'm just leaving that for the pointer.
So we are running out of time now. So if you could just move, turn to the floor, and then we'll get back. We'll get back after a while. So if there are any questions from the audience, please, we have time for one or two questions. Anyone?
Let me get my last
All right,
word
so in the meantime, you can think of a question.
Just a few things, and I'm not going to take very long. The business of land-based missiles hitting moving ships is a debate which has not yet been settled, including DF-21. Naval forces are not static, as you know. They're continuously mobile, not only by location, but within the location itself. It's not easy to hit a ship with a ballistic missile. Now, these could be portrayed as naval arguments, but we should think about them. For example, an aircraft carrier is a happy target for almost all sorts of critics. And why not? It's a huge investment of money in one single platform, and questions of vulnerability do come in. But as we all know in the military, there is countermeasures and countermeasures. The carrier is not as vulnerable as most people think or would lead people to believe. That doesn't mean it is not vulnerable at all. So like any other military platform, from a tank or an aircraft to a ship, vulnerability, counter-vulnerability, that issue carries on. And we must have a balanced view on this. But the fact is, the carrier takes a lot of money. So it's a national decision. It's certainly not the Navy's. The Navy can only project it. It's not within the naval this thing to do it. And just one thing I want to leave this audience with, and that is because you are in the business of borders. The Navy is not a cross-border force. It doesn't cross borders to fight. The Navy actually does not defend coastlines either. The Navy just doesn't defend borders. The Navy sails out into the deep ocean, seeks out the enemy, and destroys him as far away from the homeland as possible, sometimes thousands of miles. The great naval battles of the past were fought tens and thousands of miles away from the homeland. So navies are not static. They are instruments of state policy. You can use them as you want in peacetime or wartime. But you must try and have that capability. And that is at the heart of the maritime strategy. Thank you.
Yes, so has anyone framed a question? Yeah, please, sir.
Lieutenant Shah. Yeah. SARC has been one of the regional groupings which has been an abject failure. In fact, none of the other regional groupings have been a failure except SARC. With the possibility of Nawaz Sharif being voted into power, as I read, do you think there's going to be a turnaround? That's number one question. Second is, has Pakistan been very smart in choosing China as an ally, which is going to be the next superpower?
I don't think Nawaz Sharif succeeded in his ambitions vis-a-vis South Asia in his first tenure. And it is very unlikely, at least at this point of time. I mean, there are too many hypotheticals. Even Nawaz Sharif coming back is a very big hypothetical. But I would say that yes, India should take an interest in SARC, in South Asia, primarily because that it's its immediate role, its immediate sphere of influence. And the influence that you can exercise in your immediate region translates as your regional and your global influence as well. And we have the great sort of magnet and power of our market in being able to exercise that influence. And we also have the influence of our, economy, of our technology and, education and so many other things, including now IT and ICT related technologies. So I would think that in a way we should give priority to SAARC. We should give priority to the economic and people-to-people aspects of SAARC. And if Nawaz Sharif is capable of playing ball with that and relegating the Pakistani army to prevent its sort of spoiling role, then I would say that yes, definitely we should play with it. And I would say one of the biggest advantages that we have in SAARC is our agriculture market. 50 to 60% of the livelihoods in this entire, if not more, lie with the, agri-sector, or land, waters, forests, and, livestock and so on. So simply just using the power of our agricultural market could be a sort of big game changer, which is something that we haven't yet tried to do. We are negotiating with Australia and others on sort of, agricultural commodities, but the, market that we have for small farmers in our own region is something that we have not tapped.
Thank you. Any more questions? We can take one last question if there's any. All right, so thank you very much. I think with that we must, we'll draw the curtains on this panel. A big thank you to the panelists and to the audience. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you at the Chanakya Defense Dialogue on the 3rd, 4th November at the Manekshaw Center, New Delhi. Thank you so much, and Jai Hind.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I request you to put your hands together and acknowledge what has been a truly enlightening discussion. Thank you, sirs. We anticipate participation of diverse populace, including academia, intelligentsia, and subject matter experts and stakeholders across various domains. This promising gathering holds the potential for enriching and informing our understanding of complex national security issues. It's been a truly rewarding morning, a truly memorable morning, and we'd like to felicitate our esteemed participants for their erudite contribution to this morning, as also cement our association. May I now request the Chief of Army Staff to kindly present mementos to our participant team. Lieutenant General Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay, Sri Jayadev Ranade, General Raj Shukla, please. Vice Admiral Anil Chopra, please. Thank you very much, sir.